Hello and welcome to Coffee with Candice. I'm your host, Candice Mama. I am so incredibly excited to be speaking to today's guest. He is the former CEO of Goldman Sachs, Sub Saharan Africa, a business maverick, a senior fellow and lecturer at Yale University, and a soon-to-be author. Colin Coleman is all of that and so much more, and I cannot wait to jump into this conversation. If you like it, please like, share, and subscribe. And without further ado, here's Colin.
Hello, how are you, Colin?
Very good. Yourself?
Good. I'm so honored that you took the time to speak to me. I know how busy you are.
Not at all. Not at all. It's one of those days, but here I am.
No, I love it. So how's it been being back in the US?
So no, it's been interesting. I arrived in the US on the 1st September. By the 5th of September, I had COVID. So I had 10 days of getting through the COVID experience, which was not that pleasant. It was like having a very bad flu, but a mild COVID, I would say. So I had, high temperatures and fever, loss of appetite, which is good for me because I've lost weight, so I'm far more handsome now. Lost sense of taste. So I had 10 days going through it. I would say good and bad experiences here. They were interesting. The one was my test, because once I realized I had it, I was actually away in the Hamptons for the weekend. By the time I realized I had it and got back, I took the test. It took 5 days for the test to come back in New York. So it really made a mockery of contact tracing or anything like that. Because by the time I was recovering was when I actually got the test result that I had been positive. So then I had the New York Health Department and various people doing contact tracing and so on and so forth. They were very effective, and they offered to put me up in a hotel free of charge, and they offered to bring me meals, and they offered thermometers and oximeters and all sorts of stuff. Unbelievable resources, but the main thing was the test took 5 days. So by the time all this arrived at my door, I was already getting better. Anyway, I recovered fully, and everything has been fine. I've been teaching. I'm writing quite a bit, trying to enjoy the city. The city is a bit of the beauty and the beast all at once without the shine, I call it, because the beauty is there's a lot of outdoor dining because you don't dine indoors so much. They have opened now restaurants for indoor dining because of it's getting into winter season. But it's beautiful pavement seating, and it's very, very lively out on the streets. That's very nice. The museums are open, but the jazz clubs are not, so that's not good for me. And there's a lot of homelessness on the streets, a lot of, and it's quite a lot of bitter and angry people walking around. So you kind of got that edge that's come back to New York. Anyway, I'm sure you don't want to go on and on about these experiences, but it is interesting times. The election is around the corner, so I'm paying a lot of attention to US politics, what's going on. And it's pretty much on the edge as to what's going to happen.
Yeah, and what's your feeling about that? What are you leaning towards?
Well, I think the polls look and seem to indicate that Biden is headed for a strong victory, but all of the narrative being built up by the Republicans and by the Trump administration is that they're going to challenge the result, and you're going to have some kind of litigation process, and unlikely that you will have a winner declared for some time. And the possibility that's being spoken about by informed people of some kind of street level protest leading to conflict and counter-conflict and the militias that are on the right wing, there's a real potential that that situation could lead to a very ugly set of confrontations in the US. I don't think you're talking civil war territory, but you are talking potential violence in the streets if the combination of the election results being litigated and it takes too long and there's a feeling of lack of credibility of the result, whatever it is. So there's some reason for concern about where this is all headed.
That sounds like you chose an incredible time to go to Yale.
So I'll be done at the end of November. The way the universities are all working, Yale included, is Thanksgiving, which is the end of November, when all the kids go back to their families, so they travel back, that they don't return to the campuses because they're concerned about the COVID environment. So the in-person classes, which I'm doing, because my classes are seminar style for graduates, both MBAs and public policy graduates, will only continue to the end of November. And then after the end of November, the last couple of classes will be virtual. So yeah, so it's going to have been 1 year of the Yale experience, and then I'll be home.
Oh, and how was the Yale experience?
I've loved it, I really love it. Look, firstly, it's a magnificent campus, a great institution. And, the people in this particular department I'm part of, which is the Jackson Institute, include really interesting people like Stephen Roach, the ex-Morgan Stanley economist, Howard Dean, who was the presidential candidate and governor of Vermont, John Podesta, who is President Obama's chief of staff, and a bunch of other economists and authors, a woman by the name of Janine De Giovanni, who was a war correspondent in Syria, Lebanon, Afghanistan, Bosnia, on which a movie is based about her. A former head of DFID in the UK, who was a candidate for Prime Minister, who was beaten by Boris Johnson. These are the kinds of people that are in the faculty with me. So it's fascinating. Another person was the Deputy Governor of the Bank of India, Rakesh Mahan. So it's been great meeting these people, getting to know them, and then the students have been fantastic, incredibly bright, very talented. With strong ambition, and they're getting the most out of my class, and the classes are pretty robust conversations. I just did a class on Nigeria last week, and I got the head of CNN in Nigeria, chief correspondent, and somebody who leads an investment bank in Nigeria on the Zoom. These Zoom things are very they're very innovative. You put them to your use, they can be very helpful. And we had a fantastic class on Nigeria and the developments there, which aren't much known. That Nigeria is experiencing quite a lot of street protests from the youth against police violence, and this is very unusual in Nigeria because of its military dictatorship past. People don't take to the streets very easily because they have a long memory of police repression in Nigeria. But it sounds like Nigeria is on the edge, as many countries are at the moment. But we had a great class, and this week we're going to do Ethiopia. I call it the Chinese model of industrialization, because what Ethiopia is experimenting is with some kind of African application of Chinese capitalism, building industrial parks, purposing industrialization, infrastructure into industrialization, and mobilizing capital in a very specific way to try and get investment. And they've been very successful. They've had 10% growth, in a country that's 100 million people now for quite some time, pre-COVID. So talk about that on Friday.
Oh, wow. And have you done South Africa yet?
So I did 3 classes on South Africa because of its importance. So the first class was on the lessons of business involvement in the transition from the 80s through to 94, and helping, which I was very personally involved in. So it was very much about the transition from apartheid to constitutional democracy. Then I taught the lessons of, the second class was on the lessons of what's happened since 1994 till now. And the last class was on scenarios for the future. And is Cyril Ramaphosa going to be able to turn around the issues in South Africa and make a success of it? So it was a fascinating series of classes. And the purpose from a student's point of view is to try, as I talk to them, to make a judgment, given that they're now in their 20s and have a career ahead of them, is South Africa, Nigeria, and Ethiopia as big engines in Africa? Are they going to make it? What is the kind of outcomes? Is it going to be a road downhill in South Africa, or a hybrid where we muddle along, or is it going to be, returning to higher growth rates and a turnaround story? Same for Nigeria, same for Ethiopia, because if the big countries do well, then Africa's engines are going to be firing. If the big countries don't do well, it doesn't matter what happens in the smaller countries, really. A precondition for Africa to work is to have these big countries really do well. So, yeah, that's at least the objective of the class. So, at the end, we had a poll amongst the students on those 3 scenarios on South Africa, and basically about 80% of the students picked the hybrid outcome, which is not surprising.
I would have picked the hybrid outcome, and I've never taken any of your classes.
There you go. You don't even need to come to one of my classes.
No, but you mentioned something about, and that's actually how we met. You've got a fascinating family. You come from a family of activists, and you yourself have been an activist. And for those people who don't know this about you, I want you to tell us just a little bit about that. What was it like growing up in that kind of family? And what was it like being an activist in South Africa?
Well, you'll have to read my book when it comes out. You'll have to host a party for me, Candice. So yeah, I mean, the experience was really triggered. I had a liberal, progressive family, but they were passive until my brother was detained in 1981 in solitary confinement for 6 months in the same cell block as Neil Agate and a whole bunch of other people. Neil died in detention, and Keith was then released and banned. So he was a journalist, and he couldn't write, or he couldn't congregate with more than one person. So that whole event of the police knocking on my door and then leading to Keith's detention and ultimately his release, and all of that was a great shock to our family and galvanized the whole family into activism. My elder brother had already been active, but my parents became very active in forming something called the Detainees Parent Support Committee, which is a human rights organization. And given what was subsequently the whole through the 1980s, tens of thousands of people in detention, it became a very important organization for detainees' families to go to get guidance as to what to do, and for detainees themselves to report how they were treated, and then after they were released to go and report affidavits. So my mother literally took for 10 years affidavits, mostly about torture that the detainees had experienced at the hands of the police at that time. And my father was, very active in collating information and disseminating information. And they were very famous globally for what they had done. I mean, they received rewards from Francois Mitterrand and, were feted in the United States for their work and so on and so forth. And then my brother Neil was very involved in the democratic movement, and particularly in the trade union movement, and was in COSATU for almost 30 years. He just left COSATU last year and created an Institute of Economic Justice, which is looking at economic policy. And I was very involved in 1981. From 1981, I was studying architecture, but I was very involved in student politics in the National Union of South African Students, in the United Democratic Front, in the End Conscription campaign. I refused to go to the army on political grounds, which was a criminal offense. Some of those that made those public statements were put in criminal jail, like David Bruce, who's a bit of a hero. And he spent several years with hardened criminals in criminal jail until he was released prior to the elections. So I joined the underground of the African National Congress. So I was in the thick of it, yeah. And from 1988 onwards, when I graduated as an architect, I joined a small group of business people who were starting to see what they could do to broker peace and economic stabilization in South Africa. And that grew quite substantially into a facilitating body that was both bilaterally speaking between business and political organizations, but became a facilitating body because business was sort of trusted by those, that organization was sort of trusted to facilitate talks. So we facilitated the peace accord. We started to act as secretariat to the CODESA talks, and ultimately helped. I was very involved in the mediation with Henry Kissinger right at the end, just before the elections, which was a last gasp attempt that failed to get the parties all into the election. And on the back of the mediation collapsing, managed to facilitate the agreement that brought Carter in when Buthelezi realized it was necessary for him to come to the election about 2 weeks before the election date. So the difference between him coming in and not coming in was very, very critical to peace at the time. And as I say, you read all about it in my book then when it comes out next year.
You know, I'm excited for your book. I'm so excited. I want to know, like, how, growing up in a situation like that, experiencing things like that, how does one keep hope alive? Because I think now, with COVID, the economic downturn, people are struggling to stay hopeful, to stay optimistic. And yet you were facing situations that were so, it didn't seem like it was going to change. And I want to know, how did you get through it? How did you continue to hope and wake up every day and keep doing what you were doing?
Well, there are lots of times, I guess, where I always felt that we had not just faced the apocalypse, that we were over the cliff into the apocalypse. When Henry Kissinger left and we had effectively turned our backs as a country on mediation, and we went going naked into the elections, knowing that violence was very likely going to erupt, and very serious stores of arms and weapons in everybody's hands. It just felt completely overwhelming. I guess in a simple way, for those who don't have income, lost jobs, they've got large families to feed, they don't know where to go. That's very overwhelming in a very personal way. And, in those moments, I think, you have to look around the corner to see what is possible. And they say politics is the art of the possible, but it's true also with life. And it can be very overwhelming. It can be for people very debilitating. But I'm personally not somebody that can operate in a debilitating sense. I have to be problem solving. I'm just like that. I have to try. So, and I always sort of see the glass half full. Whatever the situation, I try and work out a way. So, I really feel for people. I think that, there must be millions of South Africans today who are totally overwhelmed by what they are facing. And each one of them needs to think how best what are the resources, who are the people, what are the networks that can get you through a bad situation, and keep at it.
Mm. And that optimistic approach, that glass half, full approach, have you always been that way, or has it come with age and as you've gone through life, or when did it come about?
Yeah, I think it has. It has been something that I think I've sort of had, all my life. Competitive spirit. I played tennis as a teenager. I was very determined to play at Wimbledon one day. When I realized that it wasn't possible, I sort of just literally cut off after playing, many hours of tennis every day. I just stopped and refocused my attention. So I guess, that spirit has been with me. But I think it's also a function of who are the people around you and what is their style of thinking. Because I think if you think in a very linear way, you tend to deal with life in that way. And I've always been taught, by my brothers and people around me that have been formative, to be lateral thinking. So sit back, see a situation, sit back, try and deconstruct it. And I love the word deconstruct because as an architect, I studied the deconstructivist movement, and literally in architecture, what the deconstructivists did, and that whole art and architecture movement, was they would take an object and look at the object, a cube or whatever it is, and pull it apart, pull out each element of each part of the cube, and give it a new angle, give it a different facet, and then they would put it back together again in a completely different way. But if you're a kind of clear observer, you will see that the elements of that cube, the original cube, exist in the solution that you're now seeing that looks nothing like a cube. So I've always sort of thought of life like that you can look at a situation. It may not be to your liking, but you can deconstruct it, take out the parts, refashion them, retool them, put them back together in a way that is both the origins of the situation you found, but also a completely different solution, sort of with the elements that you had. So I don't know if that helps, but I've always kind of used that approach to try and refashion, particularly when I'm overwhelmed or have a particular problem, try and look at it in a completely different light, but not ignore what's there. You have to use what's there and just retool it. So that's I think at the kind of the core of the way I think.
Oh, I absolutely love that. I will be using that analogy for my own life, because sometimes I think we get so stuck in our minds, right? And we're looking at a problem and we're like, this is the thing. It can't change, you can't maneuver it. But truthfully, if you step back and you do repurpose it and you look at it differently, usually you get a different outcome. But you mentioned something. So you went from tennis to architecture to economics. Like, what does that transition look like? Like when you were an architect, I'm pretty sure you weren't like, I'm going to go to Goldman Sachs. So what's that like?
No. So, yeah, I mean, I guess life, people grow up, what are you going to be when you grow up? Firstly, I would say my my grandfather, my mother's father, who was born in Johannesburg in 1886, the year of its founding. So I always say to everyone, I'm truly a Joburger. My younger son, who is turning 7 in January, is a 4th generation Johannesburg boy. So, and white families, people don't think white families have legacy in the country. I mean, we know nothing else, right? So, so I'm like truly a Joburger, I'm a Joburg boy. So, what is this Joburg boy going to do? Well, the fact is that I had this kind of normal childhood in an abnormal society, growing up under apartheid, and then, decided to go to university and study architecture. At the time, not really knowing, but it was quite a good choice. I think probably now I would have probably benefited more from law or something like that if I'd gone in. But architecture provided a way of thinking that I just explained to you, which was great. And you remember, with an architecture drawing, you start with a blank sheet of paper, and your most important thing that you do with that blank sheet of paper is the first line, because whatever your first line is that you draw is the seeds of your design. And I think about that when I'm writing a book. What are you going to write? And then you think, oh, I'm going to write that, but then your words actually come. So, or an essay or anything. So the way you commit your first thing is going to be formative. So anyway, so architecture was useful as a way of thinking, but the truth was the politics of what was going on the campus, and the campus was a vibrant, deeply conflicted place because of the apartheid environment. The education was partly academic in architecture, and much more importantly about life and about the non-racial struggle in South Africa, and meeting people and forming friendships with many, many people, and having real political engagement and discussions, battling the police, fearing for your life, all sorts of stuff that was going on the campus. But life sort of took over, and because of the politics, that sort of pushed me after architecture into this negotiation, facilitating experience, which was effectively almost 6 years. And in '94, actually, it's probably not well known, but I was on the ANC electoral list for Parliament. My name was 166th on the ANC election list. But I was involved in this non-partisan organization, and I wasn't asked about being standing on the ANC for the ANC list. So when this list came out, I had to basically make a quick decision, and I decided to withdraw my name. I was 31, but effectively going into politics, like in a formal sense, at the age of 31, many people, including some of South Africa's top leadership, advised me against it, saying, go and tool yourself, skill yourself, get financially independent, and at some stage later, you can always go into politics, but you'll be much more useful in the economy. So that's what made me go into banking. So after '94, when the elections were held, I decided to go into the economy, and as it was, I got a lot of offers from financial institutions. I decided not to go into the government-related ones, but rather go into the private sector ones. And I worked for Conrad Strauss as the chairman of Standard Bank for, that was my first job, and that mutated into my starting a public finance division for Standard Bank under Jacques Marie, and started an infrastructure fund to drive infrastructure, public-private partnerships and the funding of that. And I was there 3 years, learned the ropes of project and corporate finance there. And then JP Morgan hired me to go to London to learn merger and acquisitions. So I did that in '97. I arrived in London the day that Princess Diana passed away. And I left in 2000 in March, when Goldman Sachs headhunted me to come back to South Africa after spending 3 years in London in the energy, oil, power merger and acquisition department of JP Morgan in London, which was a great learning experience. Got exposed to a new country, a new product, global banking in a new continent. It was a multiple learning curve. And I was building a young family at the time. We took one daughter with us to London. We had a daughter in London. And just before I came back, my then wife conceived the first of my two sons. So it was a very interesting time, but effectively decided to go into banking after 94, because from my point of view, the economy was the next site of big challenge. Banking is a fantastic leverage point into all aspects of the economy. And so I've had 25 years in banking, 20 years at Goldman Sachs, 10 years as a partner at Goldman Sachs, before I retired at the end of last year to go into my new phase, which we can chat about.
Oh, wow. And are there ever any moments where you're like, oh, I should have been an architect? Or do you take out that spirit in other ways?
It's more the latter. You know, I have a few homes, and I've taken an active interest in designing and decorating those homes. So I've got homes in Johannesburg. I have a house in Plettenberg Bay, which is more just a beach house, but it's lovely. And I have an apartment in Cape Town. And the apartment in Cape Town, we just ripped it apart and redid it. And it's 100 square meters, one of my favorite spaces, because it sits right on top of the sea. And it's the concept was basically a cube, like a box. It's a double volume cube. And basically I had this sort of impulse that I wanted to have, because I love brass and copper. So we clad the walls and the ceiling with brass, studded brass, and then you've got this blue sky and this blue sea right in front of you, this view. And it's and I have colorful furniture, so it's just a stunning place. But yeah, so I use my architecture creativity. I love museums. I love art. You can see a piece behind me by a Ghanaian. I love African art. I love Chinese art. And I love going to the museum. So you'll find me in Guggenheim Museum or Whitney Museum or Museum of Modern Art here in New York as much as I can. Because that's my creative side is still there. I don't play musical instruments. I'd love to. I'd love to play the saxophone or play the piano or something, but I don't have any musical talent.
Well, you can always take that on now after your book. The saxophone can be the first.
Okay. We'll try.
No, and I think all of us, after you told us that, I think all of us want to come to your house in Cape Town. So I think the book launch should be there, and we should just like marvel in this beauty.
It can't take many people. It's 100 square meters. So we can have a small cocktail party there.
We'll take a small cocktail party.
Good.
So now we spoke about, your transition out of Goldman Sachs and into Yale, and you're writing your book. How is that experience for you? Like, how are you feeling? How's it going? How's the process?
You've done a book, so I'm sure you know it well. It's sort of something that I've promised myself I would do, because for a few reasons, I think there's a story that people need to hear about how business and politics interacts. And in the world, the rise of populism and so on, people feel very disengaged. I would say there's a sense that the establishment is for the rich and the powerful and the connected, and politics is a one-year ritual. Once upon a time, every 5-year ritual for voters, and that's not democracy. So, and societies can go off in very negative directions, as you've seen happening in most of the big countries in the world. And this rise of populism and you know, there's this COVID recovery. I don't know if you heard of the concept of a K-shaped recovery. You know, you have the V shape. The V shape is things go down and they come all the way back. The W shape is they go down, they come back, they go down, and they come back. Like, you know, with the bursts of the new bursts of COVID that we're expecting in the Northern Hemisphere now, and a resurge, and then the economy will close down, and then it will come back, and then you'll have your W. Well, actually, the K-shaped recovery is that you came down, and then for some, it went up again. And for others, it came down. But so what it really signifies is for the rich and powerful and the connected, people in the equity markets and so on, who own Apple stock and blah, 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 they've done great. But for the people who, minorities in these countries, the unemployed, the poor, and the lower middle classes, they've suffered enormously, because that's what happens with crisis. It tends to be a huge blow to the middle classes and to the poor. And whilst there has been stimulus, you know, like in the United States, the stimulus is running out. They haven't yet refinanced the stimulus. In South Africa, we'll hear, you know, the COVID 350 Rand grant that 5 million people, I understand, are on, has come to an end. And now those people have nothing. We'll hear in the next, tomorrow from the president, and then in the next week or two from the Minister of Finance of the budget speech. Are they going to extend that grant or not? I don't know. But I think it would be a shame if they don't, because you'll be having 5 million people without any income. So, what I'm saying is, I think, just back to the book, there is a big story to tell about what is the role of business in the political environment and vice versa, and how does business take responsibility for some of these issues around inequality that are driving so much of the political discourse at the moment. So there's kind of a story to tell there, and you know, through the story I've told you already, you know, I have had a lot of experience of that in South Africa, both in my struggle days, in the constitutional transition days, and in my banking and Goldman Sachs days. So I've had a wide range of experience there. And then I think there's a lot of history embedded there that's worth telling, a lot of color. And I hope that it'll be interesting and racy as opposed to boring and academic. So I'm trying to take things that are factual and analytical and put them in a very presentable way, so that, you know, someone in the Midwest of America or in the countryside in France will think this is an interesting story and applicable and universally applicable to their situation. So anyway, that's sort of what I'm trying, you know. And then there's the issue of can I maintain discipline in writing, and how much time I spend writing. And I'm sure you've been through that, so you know the difficulties. And I get interrupted a lot. So, you know, I have greatest plans every day to write 4 hours the next day, and I end up writing for an hour. But somehow it's still working, and it's coming along.
Oh, I know. The process is so interesting. I think at one point I only took solace in the fact that I would research really famous authors, and I'd realized, you know, the commonality was none of them really had the time to write. So I was like, oh, thank goodness. And my favorite is Paulo Coelho, and he would speak about, you know, how we'd make these grand plans during the day, and he'd only start writing at midnight, and he'd get like an hour in, then he'd go to bed. And I was like, well, he wrote the greatest book of all time, in my opinion, The Alchemist. And if he could do that, the rest of us are fine, Colin. You'll be fine.
All right.
Oh, man. So as far as your book is concerned, you said you wanted it to be interesting. So you're going to include a lot of your personal story, or are you going to make it like a dual book where people can take those business and political lessons while intertwining your personal story? or how are you envisioning it coming along right now?
Yeah, well, I'm a bit shy about talking about my book too much because I don't want to say things that then are not fulfilled. But it is going to be, what I will say, it is going to be a personal story wrapped in a framework of my view of the world. And hopefully it'll be an interesting journey for the readers.
I'm sure it will be. You've got an interesting story. I know you're not sharing all of it, but I'm going to wait for the book. I'm patient. So one thing I saw you said in an interview was the fact that when you left Goldman Sachs, it gives you a bigger voice to be able to really, speak about Africa and speak about South Africa. So for you, what is this voice? Like, what is it that you want to bring attention to? What is it that you want to, work towards now that you're out of that arena?
Well, I'm very focused on the country, and I'm very focused on the continent and its contribution to the world. I mean, in very, very simple terms, if South Africa doesn't work, if we don't rise, Africa is in trouble. And if Africa is in trouble, it's got dramatic impact on the rest of the world. And for this reason, today, 17% of the world's population of 7.8 billion people are African, with only 3% of the world's GDP. By 2060, that'll be 28% of the world's population. And by the year 2100, it'll be 39, call it 40% of the world's population, according to respected scientific population projections. If 40% of the world's population is African, and our contribution to growth doesn't rise from this 3% significantly, we're going to have a humanitarian disaster in the world, because there's no way that 40% of the world's population can share, 10, 12% of the world's GDP. So at the current rate, so the question is, what rate do we need to grow at? We need to grow at about 6%, I'm talking across Africa, 6% growth rate per annum for the next 30 years, in order for that 28% to be about 12% of the world's GDP. So that's, for the world, two things. One is a humanitarian threat and a massive economic opportunity. Because if we do achieve those kinds of growth rates, it'll be the single largest growth driver in the world in the next 30 years. So that's why I call my Yale course the last frontier of global growth, because, Africa could in the next 40 years be the way China has been for the world in the last 40 years, a massive driver of absolute growth rates. But what we know is it's highly unlikely, with or without COVID or other things, that the population is going to be much less than 40% of the world by the year 2100. So South Africa's importance for Africa and Africa's importance in the world are all interlinked. So to my mind, it's critical that South Africa succeeds. And, this kind of last 10 years of pre-Ramaphosa, of Zuma politics, has been extremely debilitating. And unfortunately, what we have now is a very shallow democracy. We have a democracy that on the surface is a thin veneer of constitutionalism, modern democracy, modern economy. But underneath it is this thick, dark force of the substance of phony capitalism, corruption, state patronage, and a system where effectively much of the environment is one in which the ruling party is used as a transmission belt to effectively get state resources and patronage into the hands of the elite, the party elite, but also into the hands of its members, sufficient that the members, through social grants and variety of inducements, keep the party in power. And this is a very bad kind of road that's a slide to the bottom. You know, this is not going to have a happy ending. So what we need is and obviously President Ramaphosa is the person we're hoping will be able to reinvigorate South Africa's democracy so that the democracy is far more functional, that you have a real civil society that's participating fully, you know, in South Africa's affairs, a business community that is really addressing inequality, really coming to terms with what it means to create wealth and growth, but distribute it in a just way amongst its employees, amongst communities, and so on. So no, we don't have a problem with business making profit, but that profit is far more egalitarian in its distribution. And politicians who and government who are not a bigger or a smaller state, but a smarter state, you know, a state that's making things work for people, and not just a captured state, you know, getting public servants to be public servants, not to be public employees doing very little and not being efficient and so on. So I'm quite passionate about those things. One of the things I talked about in a lecture I gave in the University of Cape Town in July, which is online for those who want it, is the need for an e-government platform. And that e-government platform would modernize and revolutionize the way in which government services are delivered to people, so that you get your home affairs, your passport documents, your tax, your all of these things, education, health records, you know, so on, online, and you have a biometric, private, secured, mobile platform. Everybody has it on their phone. You know, you have that phone, and you look it up, and you can see. You don't have to go to a government office for a prescription for your domestic worker to get the pills that she needs, so she has to go, you know, stand in a queue for hours and hours. For what purpose? So, and that will mean not necessarily that less money is invested in the public service, but smarter money is invested in public service, and more money is released for frontline people to be on the streets as public servants, police, education, you know, teachers, nurses, so on and so forth. And taking out a lot of the back office bureaucracy that is in the government, you know. So it's very expensive. We cannot afford it anymore. So there are countries like Estonia, Italy, Sweden, others that have made a lot of headway on this e-government idea. But it's this sort of rethinking that's needed everywhere, by the way. I mean, to get my social security number in the United States took me 2 weeks. I had to go to an office in a line, wait in line, very pleasant people. But when I finished and I asked, so can I have my security? No, it will be posted to you. I get like something that's like a cardboard piece of paper. It's not even a laminated card. It's like, you know, in the post office 2 weeks later. I mean, you know, this is America. It should be digital. It should be online. I shouldn't have to stand in a queue. Maybe they need my fingerprints, but that's about it. So we've got a long way to apply technology the way that, you know, we have Uber and Amazon and all of these things, and Netflix and everything online. We've got a long way to apply that in the government environment. And I think that's going to be a wave of the future.
Wow. I mean, Colin, I could speak to you forever because you're such a well of wisdom, but you don't have forever. You're a busy man. so
Do you have a lunch to go to or dinner?
No, I like after this, I'm going to bed. No, I'm kidding.
I know you better than that.
So, but I think for me, wrapping it up, firstly, I'm going to put a link to that lecture because I think people would benefit tremendously from listening to it. But to wrap up and change gears, I want to know if you had a time capsule and you could go to 18-year-old Colin and you could tell yourself anything, what would you say?
I'd say you're very fortunate. You're going to go on a ride. That ride is sometimes going to be, you know, a tiger on, you're going to feel like a tiger on the plains, or it's sometimes going to be a flat plane and you'll just ride it and it'll feel beautiful. Sometimes it's going to be really rocky. it's going to be a mountain, and you're going to feel like you're falling off. Sometimes you'll injure yourself through your own actions. Sometimes you will feel like you're falling off, but you're not. And you just hang on and make the most of it, and don't, self-injure, and keep on, and just think about where you want to go, and just keep going there.
Oh, I think all of us will be taking 18-year-old Colin's advice. But Colin, thank you so much. I've loved speaking to
Pleasure.
Your wisdom, and I think all of us have so much to reflect on, just based on what you've said here and all the material about you online. Like, I mean, I think I watched you so much this week. I think I might know you better than you know yourself.
I absolutely loved this conversation, and I know for sure I will be sure to note not to self-injure and to stay focused even when things get hard. And we know that this year's been a particularly difficult one. Thank you so much for listening, and be sure to like, share, and subscribe, and I'll speak to you soon.